when I decided to build a modest red barn on the far edge of my rural property. The last thing I expected was a war with the HOA. I lived just outside their subdivision, close enough that their board members drove past my land every day, but far enough that their rules had never applied to me. My family had owned this land for nearly 70 years. It was surveyed, fenced, documented, and peaceful, until the morning 3 HOA board members marched up my driveway, like they were the local sheriff's department. The tallest one, a stiff man named Carter, tapped on my door with the confidence of a tax collector. "We need to talk," he said, as if he had jurisdiction over anything that happened on my soil. Behind him stood a classic Karen, clipboard, sunglasses, and a sour expression like she'd smelled a dead animal. Her name, ironically, was Sharon, but everyone in town called her HOA Karen. Beside her stood a younger board member, who looked terrified to be there. I stepped outside. "What's the problem?" Carter wasted no time. "Your new barn is encroaching on HOA land. You're violating Community Code 14B regarding unauthorized structures." I stared at him, genuinely confused. "HOA land? This isn't your land. You don't even have authority out here." Karen jabbed her clipboard at the field. "According to our maps, that strip of land belongs to the Meadowbrook HOA. Your barn sits directly on it." I almost laughed. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm. "Your maps are wrong. My grandfather surveyed this land decades ago. I've got the original documents, and they clearly show the boundary line 50 feet past where my barn stands." The younger board member shifted nervously, whispering, "Maybe we should verify." But Karen snapped, "No, we know what we're doing." They handed me a notice of violation, along with a demand that I tear the barn down within 10 days or face legal consequences. From the HOA, the arrogance was unbelievable. They didn't ask. They didn't request a conversation. They simply decided they owned the land and expected me to comply. That night, I dug up every document my grandfather left behind: surveys, plats, boundary maps, all of it. And the more I reviewed, the more absurd their claim became. Not only was my barn entirely on my land, but the old survey suggested something bigger, much bigger. Several houses from the HOA subdivision might actually be sitting on my property, not theirs. It was almost too outrageous to believe. But the numbers, the markers, and the maps all aligned. Their accusation was about to blow up in their faces. The next morning, I drove into town to meet with a professional surveyor named Mark Delton. He'd worked the area for 30 years and had a reputation for being precise, almost obsessively so. When I showed him the HOA's notice and my grandfather's old documents, he raised an eyebrow. "They're claiming your barn is on their land?" he asked, flipping through the yellowed papers. "These boundaries look legitimate, but let's verify everything with modern equipment." We spent the entire afternoon walking the property line. Mark carried his GPS rover and scanning gear while I pointed out the old iron markers my grandfather had hammered into the ground decades ago. Some were rusted, some buried, but every one matched the measurements on the survey from the 1960s. By sunset, Mark finished his calculations and let out a slow whistle. "Well," he said, "your barn is definitely on your property. No question there." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Good. I figured as much." But then Mark hesitated. "That's not all," he continued, tapping his tablet screen. "Based on the original boundary, the HOA subdivision, well, several of their houses actually extend onto your land." My stomach dropped, not from fear, but from pure astonishment. "How many houses are we talking about?" "At least 5, he answered. "Possibly 8 if we factor in their driveways and fencing. That entire cul-de-sac sits over the original survey line." "How is that even possible?" Mark shrugged. "Developers cut corners. Someone misread a map or shifted a marker. Maybe the HOA used a cheap survey back when they built. But legally, you own this land." For a moment, I just stood there staring at the rows of houses. Those families had probably lived there for years without knowing. Meanwhile, the HOA had stormed onto my property, demanding I tear down my barn. "Do you want me to file an official survey report?" Mark asked. "Yes," I said immediately. "Do it, and make sure it's airtight. I have a feeling this is going to court." And I was right. 2 days later, the HOA sent me a second notice, this one threatening daily fines. Karen showed up again, snapping pictures of my barn like she was collecting evidence for a murder case. I didn't bother arguing. Instead, I handed her a copy of Mark's preliminary findings. Her face drained of color as she skimmed the pages. This must be wrong, she whispered. It isn't, I replied. And the final report will be ready by Friday. For the first time, she didn't have anything to say. She simply walked off, clutching the papers. It was clear, the HOA had picked the wrong fight. By the time the hearing date arrived, word had spread across the entire subdivision. Some homeowners glared at me when I drove past. Others gave me quiet nods of sympathy. No one really knew what was happening, only that the HOA had dragged me into court over my barn. What they didn't know, at least not yet, was that the hearing would expose a far bigger problem for them than anything they could accuse me of. The courtroom was small but packed. HOA members filled 2 full rows, whispering behind their binders. At the center sat Karen, gripping a folder like it was a shield. Carter sat beside her, trying to look confident but visibly sweating through his shirt. My attorney, a calm and sharp woman named Evelyn, rested a hand on my shoulder. Let them talk first, she said. Their arrogance will help us. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The HOA's lawyer launched into an immediate tirade, waving photos of my barn as if it were a national threat. Your Honor, this structure was erected on HOA land without approval, violating multiple sections of our community charter, he proclaimed. We request an immediate order for demolition. The judge turned to Evelyn. Counsel. She rose slowly. Your Honor, we believe the HOA has made a catastrophic mistake. A rumble of confusion spread through the room. Evelyn clicked a remote, and the lights dimmed as a projector flickered on. The first image appeared, Mark's updated survey map, complete with boundary lines, coordinates, and official stamps. This, Evelyn said, is the modern survey of my client's land. The judge leaned forward. And what does it show? Evelyn zoomed in on the highlighted measurements. First, that the barn is fully on my client's land. Not 1 inch crosses into HOA territory. Karen shot up from her seat. That's impossible. Our documents. Evelyn cut her off gently. I'm not finished. The next slide appeared, and the entire room went silent. It showed the subdivision, neat. Rows of houses, and a bold red line indicating the true property boundary. 5 houses fully crossed over it. 3 more touched it. A playground sat entirely on my land. Gasps rippled through the homeowners seated behind the HOA board. These homes, Evelyn continued, were built on land that belongs to my client. The HOA not only misinterpreted their boundaries, they have been collecting dues, issuing rules, and enforcing regulations on land that was never theirs. The judge slowly removed his glasses. Is this accurate? Mark, seated behind me, stood. Yes, Your Honor. I certify this survey as correct. Karen collapsed back into her seat, her face blank with shock. The HOA had come to demolish my barn. Instead, they had just discovered they were trespassing on my property, and had been for years. The courthouse hallway buzzed like a shaken beehive. HOA board members huddled together, talking in frantic whispers. Homeowners paced back and forth, some furious, some pale, some in complete disbelief. Meanwhile, I leaned against the wall, watching the panic unfold with a strange mix of relief and justice. Evelyn walked over, tapping a stack of papers against her palm. They want to talk, she said. Let them come to us. Sure enough, Carter and Karen approached like defeated soldiers. The arrogance they'd carried. When they marched onto my property was gone, replaced with fear. Real fear. Carter cleared his throat. We'd like to resolve this amicably. Amicably, I repeated. You falsely accused me, threatened fines, tried to demolish my barn, and marched into court with faulty documents. Now you want amicable? Karen swallowed hard. We didn't know. The developer. Evelyn stepped between us. Save it. My client has options, and none of them favor you. We returned to the courtroom where the judge prepared his ruling. When everyone settled, he addressed the room with a stern calm that demanded silence. Based on the certified survey and documentation, he said, I find that the barn is legally constructed on the defendant's property. Additionally, it appears that several homes belonging to HOA members encroach on his land. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. It will be up to the defendant to determine how he wishes to proceed. Compensation, easements, land sales, or further litigation, all are legitimate routes. The HOA board collectively deflated, looking like children caught stealing cookies. The homeowners behind them erupted, some angry at the developer, others at the HOA, and a few even yelling directly at Karen. Once the noise settled, the judge added, "For now, all HOA actions against the defendant are dismissed with prejudice." With that, the gavel fell. Case closed. Outside, a group of homeowners approached me carefully. They weren't angry, just anxious. "Sir," one of them said, "our whole lives are in those houses. What's going to happen to us?" I looked at the patchwork of faces, families, retirees, young couples. They weren't the ones who had harassed me. They weren't the ones who'd acted entitled. And despite everything, I wasn't interested in revenge. "That's up to the HOA," I answered. "They started the fight. They can finish it, fairly." Evelyn smiled. "We can negotiate easements. The homeowners won't lose their homes, but the HOA will pay for the mistake." When the board heard that, their faces went pale. The same HOA that tried to bully me into tearing down my barn would now be forced to compensate me, possibly millions, just to keep their subdivision legally intact. Justice, delivered neatly. And as I drove home past my barn glowing in the afternoon sun, I couldn't help but think, they should have just left me alone.